Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to everybody to this lecture by Professor Stephen Mitchell. I think it's a bit too cozy maybe, but I hope that the clima will start cooling everything down. So I'm going to try and introduce Stephen Mitchell. Many of you know Stephen anyway. And I'm going to try and give a very brief overview of his achievements. But with Stephen Mitchell, even that means that I'm going to have to say quite a bit. So his academic career started in Oxford, St John's College, where he did his undergraduate, his master's, as well as his D.Phil. Then he made a detour over Bristol University to end up back in Christ Church College, back in Oxford, for 2 years. And then he started his career at the University of Wales in Swansea, where he taught from 1976 to 2001, and where he progressed from lecturer to senior lecturer to reader to full professor. And he was also chairman of the Institutes of Classics and Ancient History from 1993 to 2001. Stephen then moved to the University of Exeter, where he was Leverhulme Professor in Hellenic Studies from 2002 to 2011, where he was also director of the Exeter Turkish Studies Institute. Since 2001, he's emeritus professor. Apart from his career at universities in the UK, he had sabbaticals at several rather renowned institutions, like the Institutes for Advanced Studies, Princeton University, USA, where he was a member of the School of Historical Studies. He also had the British Academy Research Readership, which he held at the University of Göttingen in Germany. Since 2002, Stephen was selected Fellow of the British Academy. But he was also recognized by several other distinguished institutions in Europe, such as he was Professeur Invité at École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris. He's Doctor Honoris Causa at Humboldt University in Berlin. He was also president at Association Internationale d'Epigraphie Grecque et Latine from 2008 to 2013. And now we get to the British Institute at Ankara. He was our honorary secretary from 2008 to 2014, and he is now the BIAA chair since 2015. His career largely focused on Turkey, and that is also very clear in his publications. He published on general issues on Turkey, like I think most of you know, Anatolia, Land, Men, and Gods in Asia Minor, but also connected to his lectureship in Exeter, several publications and monographies on religion in antiquity. Stephen worked in Pisidia for many years. He started in the 1980s, and he worked till the very end of the 1990s in Pisidia. And here again, several publications: Kremna, Pisidian Antioch, the inscriptions of central Pisidia. And then again we get closer to where we all are today, because Stephen also worked extensively on Ankara itself. Together with Kutalmış Görkan and Musa Kadıoğlu, he published Roman Ankara. And together with David French, he published a corpus in 2 volumes on the inscriptions of Ankara. Today's topic is one on which Stephen said, food in Turkey, no matter what you think about Turkey, food in Turkey is always good. So I'm going to talk about food. Food, culture and empire in ancient Anatolia. And yet again, this topic is related to the British Institute at Ankara, because the subtitle reads, A Lecture in Memory of Professor Gordon Hillman, Archaeobotanist Extraordinaire. And many of you may know that Gordon Hillman was archaeobotanist extraordinaire in the excavations of David French. He is the one who built up the reference collection of the seeds reference collection of the BIAA, which is just behind the wall here in the BIAA lab. So, and Stephen is going to explain you a bit more on how, why, and what. I hope you will all enjoy the lecture, and I would like to give the word to Stephen now.
Thank you very much, Lut, for that very generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here lecturing again. The last time I lectured in Ankara, I gave a lecture which I entitled A New History of Byzantine Ankara, which met with a bemused comment from one of my audience. Said, Byzantine Ankara? What on earth is that about? Was there such a thing? So this time I thought I'd talk about food, because everybody knows that there's such a thing as food and that it's very important, and it's very important in Turkey today, and it was very important in Turkey or Anatolia in antiquity as well. So at least we could start on a sort of familiar territory with, you know, the old adage that you are what you eat, and that everybody knows, or at least the common assumption is, that there are few things that define the character and identity of a nation more clearly than its food culture. Whether you talk about fish and chips, or doner kebab, or pizza, or a Big Mac, you know exactly who I'm talking about and what group is most closely associated with those foodstuffs. And that, I think, was probably as true in ancient Anatolia as it is in modern Turkey and in Europe. And so I'm going to do a completely foolish thing and try to, well, I can't possibly tell you the whole story, even if I knew it, of the food culture of ancient Anatolia, but I'm going to try to pick a way through, find a sort of fil rouge which will take us through this topic and give you some idea of the diversity and interest of this subject, which I think is hugely under-researched. I think there are enormous opportunities for historians, for archaeologists, for scientists of many descriptions and inquirers to do much more profound research about food in historical and social contexts, which can bring alive the cultures, the history, the environment of ancient Turkey, modern Turkey, as well, of course, as any other part of the world where we have well-developed civilizations. And I suppose the argument that I'm going to try and put across is that the food culture's changed as the empires and civilizations that dominated the Turkish landscape changed over time. This is not a constant, it's not decided by environmental things which said you eat the only things that grow here. Things change over time, patterns of food consumption change over time. Huge topic, I can't possibly do more than sketch a few ideas. As Lut said, this talk is sort of when I first came to Ankara as a postgraduate student in 1970, I found myself in a room next to another relative newcomer to Turkey, and this was Gordon Hillman, a botanist, about in the course of turning himself into probably the leading archaeobotanist of his generation, at least certainly working out of the UK. He, I think, came to Turkey the year before me in 1969, but it was a great privilege to work already with him as such a extraordinary enthusiastic expert, as a trained botanist who really invented the science of archaeobotany, certainly as far as work in Turkey and the Middle East was concerned. Or if he didn't invent it, he was one of the 3 people who could be said to have made a difference. This was a photograph taken of him in June 1971, collecting, as he covered huge parts of Turkey looking for plants. This is looking for wild einkorn, the ancestor of wheat, which is of course now actually cultivated again as a food crop for sort of specialist reasons, and was of crucial importance in tracing the origins of cereal agriculture in Turkey. Picture actually was taken by my younger brother, who was on the slopes of Karadağ in 1971. I'm delighted that he took a very evocative picture of the man in action. the other place I met Gordon Hillman was actually in Berlin, where I now live. And this poster, or it's in fact a whole mural on the wall of the railway station, or of a bakery at the railway station at Hackischer Hof in the middle of Berlin, Camps. It tells the story of the cultivation of rye, Çavdar, and including the comment that the first rye farmers were in northern Syria, and the discoverer of their practices was none other than Gordon Hillman, who he's acquired an extra N in the spelling of his name. He's become Hillman, as in a proper Germanic fashion, but he's correctly identified as a professor at University College London. That was a nice discovery to make on the wall of a Berlin bakery. Since the origin of domestication and the first agricultural settlements, which emerged in Upper Mesopotamia in the 9th and 8th millennium BC, grain and cereal products provided the basis for every diet at every level of ancient society, and would have been grown everywhere in Asia Minor as far as conditions allowed. Oh, I've got slightly ahead of myself. Lut has already mentioned that Gordon Hillman laid the foundations, indeed established effectively our botanical collection in this institute, both the ancient seeds and the modern samples against which they can be compared. That grew out of his work at the Ashvan excavation project, which where I was working as well, and it was only just over a year ago that we finally brought that story to an end by publishing the volume on the archaeobotany of Ashvan, which Gordon himself didn't complete the writing of, but he'd laid the foundations for the volume that Mark Nesbitt and Jennifer Bates worked into the final publication. I think, despite the age of the excavation 50 years ago nearly, that report contains really valuable material for current researchers too. A little bit sort of more or less sort of technical stuff. I'm going to just talk a little bit about cereal culture, and then move on to the sort of more exciting foodstuffs which define cultures in the classical period. But you can't avoid cereals, because 80% of the nutritional value of the diets of Mediterranean people came from grain products, whether bread or sort of grain porridge. That was true in antiquity and has been true up until very recent times in Turkey and elsewhere. In fact, there's an important lesson, I think, here for the modern world. We need to start to get back towards that figure if we're going to save the planet from over-exploitation. If we invest far too many of our resources in trying to produce meat and too few of our resources in trying to produce cereals, the balance is not sustainable in the long term. The horrifying figure I read in an English newspaper 2 weeks ago, that 25% of all the money that's collected by the European Union, which is then used on projects, is in fact used, it goes to the agricultural policy, and 25% of all the money that comes in is used for livestock raising, which is an absurdly high figure that we redeploy our wealth to produce more cattle and pigs and sheep and goats to make meat for people to have in their diets, and it's a colossal misdirection of resources, which is only going to undermine our future possibilities. Horrific fact which I had not really appreciate it until I read that article. Grain was the staple in the landscapes of the interior of Asia Minor. And when you get to the Roman and Greek periods, it's remarkable the number of authors who comment about the grains, the grain types that were grown there. So I just put a little list up there, the cereal varieties. This, of course, there were many more types grown than I've listed, but this already gives you some idea that the spelt type wheats, which are descendants of einkorn grown in the east, also grown around Eskişehir, Bolu, Gerede area. We learned that from the medical writer Galen. Xenophon, when he took his 10,000 Greeks, or what was left of them, back through northern Turkey, came to Bithynia, to northwest Turkey, and comments on the barley that was grown there. Galen talks about barley as a major crop in Cappadocia. The Pontic region in the northeast was a particular centre for the growing of millet and sorghum, which are late summer cereal crops that require irrigation generally. And in fact, Ashvan Botany volume traces the introduction of millet and sorghum wheats into the cultivation there precisely in the Hellenistic period. And then high quality wheats in Cappadocia, mentioned by Athenaeus. That's only a sample of the actually rich sources of information we have from ancient writers about the grain types grown precisely in Anatolia. Better source really than for any other part of the ancient world. As you know, interior of Anatolia is highland. About 25% of the surface area of modern Turkey is over 1,200 meters above sea level. A quarter is really highland, 1,200 meters. You're 200, 300 meters higher than Ankara already. And less than 2/5 of the area, less than 40%, is below 460 meters. So Anatolia is upland mostly, and that means harsh climates. And the further east you go, the harsher the climates become. And of course, there's lots and lots of evidence. Well, most of you will have experienced it in your lives, but there's plenty of evidence from antiquity for the impact of harsh climate. And I just picked this because I happen to have been reading it for another reason. One of the church fathers, Gregory of Nyssa, talking about the area around Sivas, where when the spring ploughing started, the ground was still heavily frosted. You had to break the soil to break frosted soil. But even at the time of the harvest, you might get snowfall in June, and it could still be bitterly cold again at these high altitudes in the east at times when you would expect summer days. No vines could be grown on the city's territory. It was too cold. So a nice little snapshot of conditions around Sivas, and this is just another snapshot, but this time a physical one, of eastern or central Cappadocia on a Roman road somewhere between Kayseri and where would it be? Arapsun or somewhere. Just a reminder that Cappadocia, ancient Cappadocia, was not, as it were, the fairy chimneys, fairly domesticated Cappadocia closer to Ankara, but east of Kayseri you get to this wild, bleak and very harsh terrain, which is also so characteristic of central eastern Anatolia. As you go further east, you get to Komagene, the land around Adıyaman and Nimrudağ, and come down from the highlands into the basin of the Euphrates. So that's the Euphrates River that you see on the left there, and this is a view across the landscape of of Commagene taken from Kiata, from the site at Eski Kiata. This was a really favourable land. This, after the harsh climates of Cappadocia, you come to this lush, well-watered, relatively warm, southeast-looking hill slopes, and in the king of Commagene, Antiochus I of Commagene, in his famous great inscriptions from Nimrodar, described this as his home country, Pantrophos Commagene, the country that could feed everyone. And if you read that long inscription, you'll find that the whole of his rule, the projection of his power, is built around giving magnificent and generous feasts for his country people and his followers on the basis of the produce that this land delivered. And there's a lot of detail, there's a lot of food detail in that, which shows how food is a central instrument of his power, but also shows how this particular little favoured smallish kingdom in southeast Anatolia sort of stands out. It's a relief. You've crossed Anatolia and you suddenly come to this favourable country of Commagene. And the same applies to the plain of Malatia. Also Malatia in the river valley coming down into the Euphrates, and I'll speak a little bit about Malatia Melitini in a minute or two's time. Contrast that, and I may have, yes, I think I probably do have a slide to show you, with the river valleys of western Turkey, the Meander, the Caister, the Hermus, the Caicus, the four great rivers that run into the Aegean, which are highly favourable to food production. You have the combination of low-lying, well-watered, irrigable land. You have accessible highlands beside them, which are also suitable to other forms of very, very beneficial cultivation, especially fruit trees. You have fruit trees, you have olive culture, you have grazing, you have other agriculture, and you have big populations that grow up in this area in antiquity. Big cities like Nisan, Tralles, Magnesia, Miletus, really large urban populations built on the agricultural generosity of this region. Abundant rural produce, large populations. That just a view showing precisely. You have the sort of the irrigated garden cultivation down in the valley, the steep hill slopes, which are nevertheless terraced and cultivable till quite high up in the mountains. I think this is the just south of the Meander Valley, looking towards ancient Orthosia. So that's a little sort of lightning sketch of some of the variety in the producing areas. And now what I want to do is take you through three little stories really about food in the Persian Empire under the Greeks, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Galatians who are in this area, and I'll end up with a very few comments about Rome, which tell a slightly different story. Start with the Persian Empire, sort of there on the map. They controlled Asia Minor for 2 centuries, from 550 to 330 BC, roughly speaking. They sent lots of colonists to western Anatolia, to precisely the area I've just been talking about, the lower Meander, especially the lower Hermus Valley, the Caicus Valley, these valleys just behind the Aegean coastline. And Persian culture, unlike Greek civilization, was not based on cities, it was based on rural landholdings. The standard unit, in a sense, the controlling unit, were large estates owned by Persian aristocracy, farmed by slaves, dependents of various sorts. Food in this sort of political setup, this social setup, was literally a sort of a form of currency. The workers and officials in the Persian Empire were paid in rations, not always entirely, and as economies became monetized, it became a bit of a mixed economy, but this idea that you paid your followers with food was a central part of the way the Persian Empire worked. It was an instrument of power, a means of distributing wealth, and a means of control. One famous anecdote, which in a rather ambiguous way illustrates this, is a story about a Greek. This is the Greek Athenian politician Themistocles, who in fact had been responsible for the trick and as well as the determination that rescued Athens from Xerxes' invasion in 480 BC by winning the Battle of Salamis. But Themistocles got into trouble with his own people, as powerful men often did in democratic Athens, and he actually ends up as an exile in Persia. And at the end of his life, there's wonderful details in Plutarch's life of Themistocles. He became a sort of a grandee, a very important person in western Anatolia. The Persians took him on board, their old enemy, and he used to talk about his career. And I love this anecdote about he became great and courted by many. And I imagine him now as rather overweight, in advanced years, in his middle or late 60s, enjoying the fruits of a somewhat checkered career. And here he is dining at a banquet and saying to his children, when a splendid table was set before him, and then an anecdote which relates to the paradoxes of his life, which I won't unscramble here. We should now have been undone had we not been undone before. And then the comment that there were 3 cities, as most writers say, were given him, what for? To provide his food, as it were, as the source of his income, his pension, you might say, as an old man in the Persian Empire. Bread, wine and meat, namely magnesia for the bread, Lampsacus upon the near Çanakkale for his wine, and meat from Mias, which was the little city close to Miletus. A little anecdote which sort of encapsulates this idea of food as a source of income. The setting for that anecdote is also interesting. The setting is Magnesia. That is the Magnesia near Priene, not Magnesia, not Manisa, but the one further south in the Meander Valley, which was a very large Ionian city, now being excavated, of course, by teams from Ankara University. It had been an important centre of Persian power, and one of the most important inscriptions that was found there is this. It's an inscription now in the Louvre. It's been in the Louvre since the 19th century, and it's a copy of the letter of the Persian king Darius, the great Persian king of the 6th century BC, sent to somebody whom he calls his slave, Gadatas. But it was re-inscribed. The copy that we have here is not the original. It's a copy made and put up in the Roman Empire at Magnesia. And Darius congratulated Gadatas, who was clearly a local, important official, for successfully introducing tree species from east of the Euphrates to a new habitat around Magnesia. He doesn't say what the species were, but a good guess is that they're what the Greeks and Romans called Persian apples, Mela persica, which were peaches. And so I suspect that Gadatas introduced peach cultivation to the area around Magnesia. And at the same time, in the second half, he says, congratulations, you've done that, but he criticized him for levying a tax on the sacred gardeners of Apollo. And you shouldn't do that. Now, these sacred gardeners of Apollo, I think, are likely, this I'm guessing, of course, but the Greek is futurgoi, and that's a word which would apply to tree planting, and we're not talking about people who planted sort of pretty flowers, or they probably did that as well, but I think that our sacred gardeners are likely to be the people who were introducing fruit plantations to the region and continued to do so in areas where there were sacred land. And so what we have here is an inscription showing the introduction of Persian tree culture, fruit tree culture, to Western Asia Minor, leading to a permanent enrichment of the agricultural potential of this region. One of the spectacular results of the Magnesia excavations, I'm afraid I've lost my photos for the moment, but I've pinched this one from an Ankara University publication, is the stadium at Magnesia, which is the biggest and best, or one of the biggest and best preserved stadia of Western Turkey now. When I visited it, I was delighted to see that one of these sections of seats is there's an inscription on the seats saying who was allowed to sit here, and it was the Association of Gardeners, the Kepuroi, and clearly professional gardeners are really a big feature of the economy and the society there, and these are, I'm sure, people who run fruit orchards and other things, and are key people for the food production there. And that's a legacy in the Roman Empire of something that had started under the Persians with the introduction of fruit tree culture to the Lower Meander Valley. Or if perhaps not the introduction, I exaggerate, but at least the enormous development of that culture. So Persian customs and food culture helped to shape the cultivation of the Lower Meander. So that's my sort of first little story about food and power, in this case in the context of the Persian Empire. Let's move on to the Greeks. Greek culture became dominant in Anatolia after the conquests of Alexander the Great. We're not talking about an empire anymore, we're talking about the spread of a culture which was disseminated through many cities, city-state culture. I don't need to say any more about that now. As most of you probably know, because it's a sort of cliche, the two most distinctive food products of Greek cities were wine and olive oil. Vine cultivation and olive cultivation, absolutely central part. It's difficult to conceive of a Greek city or Greek city culture without those two products. They are, if you like, the fish and chips of ancient Greece. Neither, of course, were invented or indeed introduced by the Greeks to Anatolia. The botanists can tell us that both vines and olives are to be found in the prehistoric cultures of Anatolia going back for thousands of years before the time of Alexander the Great. That's not the point. The point is not that they were introduced by the Greeks, but that they form this central part of society, nutrition, society, social life, through the various uses and enjoyments and that could be made of these two products. Food is never a story just of consumption and nutrition. It's always a story of a social context in which the food is prepared, distributed, consumed, enjoyed, rationed, or whatever. That creates the aura around food. That's why food is such an important cultural marker. Now, wine growing in Western Asia Minor is richly documented, very just like those sources about grain. You can produce lots and lots of lists of the different types of wines that are grown in different areas and their qualities and their comments. People were just as interested in wine in antiquity as they are today, and there were fine wines and less fine wines and connoisseurs' interest and so on and so forth. I think one of the reasons why they did so well, of course, in Western Asia Minor is not only was you had good soil and appropriate conditions for growing them, but also you had all these cities full of people who needed to consume the stuff. So you had a market straight on your doorstep, and it becomes a very sophisticated consumption and production market. But when you try to sort of make sense of wine as a cultural marker, you can sort of take for granted that in Ephesus and Pergamon and Perge and Aspendos and so on, wine was produced and consumed as a central everyday part of life. When it becomes interesting is when you see wine produced in remote regions where Greek culture had hardly reached. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of that. And this is going back to Melitene, to Malatia, this favoured zone of eastern Cappadocia going down to the Euphrates, which is a counterpart on a smaller scale of the Adiyaman region of Commagene. And this is Strabo. Melitene is similar to Commagene, for the whole of it is planted with fruit trees. The only country in all of Cappadocia of which this is true, not those desolate steppes of the middle, but these favoured parts of the east. And it produces not only the olive, but also a special wine, the Monarites wine, which rivals Greek wines. So, he's proud of his local produce. I mean, I was amazed when I first went to Turkey and found that Elazığ was such a good area for producing wine. And this is sort of the same amazement. We produce really great wine on the Euphrates. And there the further geographical description. So Malatia has a little story to tell about wine, but also about Hellenization, the absorption of Greek culture there. The other example is one a little bit closer to home. This is Pisidia, eastern Pisidia. Again, Strabo's description. This is the region a little bit west of Konya, going into between Konya and Beşiktaş. And there's a list of the 12 cities of Pisidia by an author who's otherwise lost to us, Anatolia. And he talks about these Pisidian cities. Some are entirely in the mountains, others extend even as far as the foothills on either side to Pamphylia and the Milias. They border on Phrygia, Lydia, Caria, etc. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but nevertheless. On the borders of Phrygia and Caria are Tabai and Cinder, and then the end, and Amblada, whence is exported, mind you, the Ambladian wine, which is suitable for use in medicinal diets. So this extremely obscure little city, which in fact is identical to modern Beşiktaş. It is, no, it's just south of Beşiktaş. Sorry, Beşiktaş. It's about 10 kilometers south of Beşiktaş. And wine. It produces a notable vintage, which is used for medicinal purposes. A nice little marker of Hellenization. That, in fact, is the site of Amblada, seen from the north. It was in March, I think that was, or late March, with the snow on the mountains behind. And then the monuments in the villages round about are all covered with grapes and vines. practically every carved monument that I saw, I saw half a dozen or so in the course of an afternoon just travelling around, they all had great vines on them. They were immensely proud. Obviously the whole country was covered with vines in antiquity. That's the medicinal wine of Amblada, exported. Olives, that's the other marker. I've written at length about olives, so I'm not going to say a great deal more, but it is worth just making the important point that olive cultivation is a sort of trace element of Greek civilization, Greek urban culture in antiquity, no doubt. It was used both for external purposes as a sort of soap in the bathhouse, and internal purposes it was consumed, so it had a much wider range of usage than modern olives do, or in a sense the usage was different. We can't, it's not just as if, of course you can make, and people do make, soap from olive oil, but most olives now are grown and produced today for consumption, whether as oil or as fruit, rather than, probably the majority of consumption in antiquity was for external use, for the bathhouses, because you used olive oil to wash yourself down and freshen yourself up after your session in the gymnasium and the bathhouse. And the point is that as new cities were created in Anatolia by the Greeks, so olive cultivation went with them. And the distribution of the growth of the olive, of course, matches the distribution, as far as possible, of the cities. And olives were certainly being produced in areas of Asia Minor in antiquity that they aren't produced in now in any significant quantity. The reason is because people have said, oh, well, olives grow mostly in coastal regions, or fairly near coastal regions, because the climate is favourable to them, and once it gets too harsh you can't actually the olive is not that climate sensitive a tree. You can grow olives in pretty difficult conditions if you know what you're doing, and the Greeks made sure that they knew what they were doing and grew olives in much more extreme conditions than people attempt today. It's culture, not climate, that decides where olives are grown. So two examples. One is that Strabo has another passage saying that Synoda, the big city just south of Aphion, or a Phrygian city, he says it's not a large city, but in fact it was quite an important city, but there lies in front of it a plain planted with olives. There are no olives there today, but it's just a little favourable bed, it's just a little bit of a depression there where olive cultivation was possible, and it was done intensively. And then here in Ankara, the Roman baths, there is several large pieces of olive presses, which can only be there because olives were grown close to Ankara in antiquity. I don't think they would have been very high quality, but they were needed. They needed the olive oil for the bathhouse, and the technology is there to produce the oil from the product. There's a bit more of Ankara's olive technology, which you can see down there. Badly in need of a proper study, incidentally. If somebody's looking for a good master's degree thesis to write, go down and measure all those olive things and get a proper reconstruction out of it, and you'll have a very nice piece of work done, I think. Olives. So those are my Greek stories. Just a little sketch. I'm going to move rapidly on to stick in this part of the world, that is to say, around Ankara, for just a quick look at a civilization that was less important, if you like, in the long term than the Persians or the Greeks, but was equally dominant in this region, that is the Galatians, the Celtic Galatians, who came from Europe in the 3rd century BC, settled intensively. They were a warrior people, but they were also agricultural settlers, and they were very successful. They built up large populations in northern central Anatolia, and Ankara, of course, was their becomes their Roman capital, at least. But the Galatians had a reputation, a food reputation of their own, and a food culture of their own, and it's sort of summed up in this little passage from the Greek author Athenaeus, writing in the 2nd century AD, but drawing on sources of the Hellenistic period, which he names, and very, very specific. We get a very, very vivid picture of the banqueting and feasting culture of these Galatians from this passage. First, the little bits: the custom to place on tables a great number of loaves broken plentifully, and meat which they just take out of cauldrons. So they had great bronze cauldrons with meat was boiled, and then this boiled meat was a main source of the feast. And then referring to a specific Galatian leader whose name we don't crop up, we don't know where he quite fits into the history, but this man Ariaramnes, who divides up the country. You know, he's the master of it. He measures it by convenient stages along the roads, and at each of these stages he erects tents, sort of marquees, each containing 400 men, and then huge cauldrons full of meat. Prepared a year in advance. It's a big investment in this feast. And the Galatians come from everywhere around, all the villages, to enjoy themselves. Passing strangers couldn't escape, as if they'd want to, but they were pressed to come in and join in the feast. And what's at the heart of this feast, of course, is meat consumption, which we haven't seen anything of so far. But the Galatians were farmers and cattle breeders, and central Anatolia was a great livestock producing area as well as a major grain producing area. And this then comes to a focus in these feasts, and again the chieftains use the instrument of an annual spectacular, extremely expensive, a potlatch in sort of anthropological terms, blowout feast to secure their status in society. And this carries on right up to the Roman period. This is the temple of Augustus in Ankara, with a very famous, a very important inscription carved along the front altar of the temple, which is a list of the Galatian priests who presided over the imperial cult right at the beginning of the Roman Empire. And they're not Romanized by any means yet. They are still tribal leaders, but they've come in under Roman rule. And each of them in their term of office has to give a benefactions to show their power and cement the loyalty of their followers. And what recurs, not uniquely but very strikingly in this inscription, are the public feasts. And these public feasts are given not just to, as it were, a group, say, like the 60 or 70 of you in this room, but to whole tribes. One gave a feast to 2 tribes, another to all 3 Galatian tribes. We're talking of thousands, tens of thousands of people, if we take that literally, who must have assembled for these feasts. And this, therefore, is the beginning of the Roman period, an exact echo of what Athenaeus described in probably 100 or 200 years earlier in the Hellenistic period. But the Galatians had brought a sort of a new change to the dietary pattern. I'm sure they consumed wine in large quantities, and they no doubt used olive oil extensively. In fact, we know from that inscription that they did. But those weren't the defining features of their food culture. The defining features was large-scale meat consumption. And as I said, central Anatolia was a large-scale, was itself a sort of cattle ranch, sheep farms, enormous quantities of livestock being produced there in this period. And again, I just pick up one little tiny illustration of that. This is a 4th century Christian gravestone from the southern edge of Galatia, northern Lycaonia. This is around Cihanbeyli, that part of central Turkey, and it's the gravestone of a Christian woman, obviously a wealthy farmer family in this in the village, and describes her among her many virtues as being from she was the wife of a man who was rich in cattle and rich in sheep. Or not sure I can pick out the Greek on the on the text, but I can do so at leisure afterwards. And so this little focus on livestock as in large quantities, not just a few sheep and cattle, an ox to till your farm, but large flocks, herds, what you like, of sheep and cattle being produced, showing that this meat culture must have been continuing. I mean, of course, that's not the only use to which you can put sheep and cattle, but I'm quite sure it was one of the main uses, that these were bred for consumption. So Galatia and the Galatians bring their own chapter to the story of Anatolia's food culture, and meat is the headline in that particular story. So I'm going to end now with the Romans, and I want to sort of turn the story a bit on its head. I'm not going to talk as nearly as much. We have so much evidence about Roman food from Asia Minor and elsewhere that I'd be going on all night, and I don't want to do that at all. So I want to just try and pick out a slightly different emphasis as to the way we might understand food as a part of Roman culture, as something a bit different from the way it could be understood with the Greeks and the Persians and the Galatians. But I can start off with one of my favourite passages about the history of this period, because it starts up here in Galatia, Ankara as well. This area first became known to the Romans when the general Gnaeus Manlius Vulso, in 189 BC, led an army up from the west coast by a rather tortuous, meandering route up to Ankara, fought 2 battles against the Galatians, won 2 victories, and then went back again. The grand old Duke of York marched to the top of the hill and marched it down again. But in the meantime, he dealt with he put paid to the Galatians and put firm imprint of Roman power on the middle of Turkey. He got back to Rome, and he wanted, as Roman generals did, to celebrate a triumph. But of course, it was always contentious celebrating a triumph, because your fellow senators were usually jealous of you, and you didn't want to allow a triumph to somebody who was, a rival. So there's always a lot of literature before a triumph about as it were, the political debate that produced. And Manlius Vulso was on the sharp end of the criticism that by his victories in the East, he had corrupted Rome. And he corrupted Rome by introducing all this loot and wealth and booty and oriental magnificence to the otherwise austere, tough, and admirable, but as it were, essentially peasant-like Romans. And so he was a source through this victory over, has to be said, these rather primitive Galatians, whose feasting habits I've just described to you. And this army returning from Asia was the origin of foreign luxury imported to the sea. This is the beginning of the slippery slope that brings Rome to this corrupt den of vice that it later becomes, and that's the narrative. They brought to Rome gilded couches, rich in tapestry, works of the loom, and what were then deemed magnificent furniture, single-footed tables and buffets. I mean, the idea that you could corrupt Rome by bringing in a sort of one of those trolleys, a drinks trolley or something, was the downfall of Rome is a drinks trolley. And then read on to the bottom, their meats from now on began to be prepared with greater care and cost, while the cook, whom the ancients considered as the meanest of their slaves, now became highly valuable. So, sort of, you can imagine, you know, this idea that Oriental cooks were sort of generated and then undermine the austere virtues of Rome by their seductive menus that they now put on the tables of the Roman aristocracy. That's Livy talking writing under Augustus, describing the furore that was brewed up around Manlius Vulso's claim to a triumph after his Galatian campaign. Now, of course, that is one way into the narrative about Roman food, because of course one of the stories about Roman food is the luxury, the excess, the splendour. Manlius's successor 100 years later was another general called Lucullus, who fought against Mithridates in eastern Anatolia and the Pontic regions beyond the Euphrates as well, was successful. He comes back to Rome prodigiously rich, and he was known as the feaster, the Roman feaster par excellence. Lucullan feasts becomes a sort of byword. And so, of course, Rome's aristocracy, its wealth, as in all empires, generated this drive to excess and huge consumption and luxury and so forth. So that is one narrative that one can follow through about Roman food. But I'm not going to follow that particular line. We're talking about an empire, and there are all sorts of ways of looking at empire. So it's not just about Roman luxury. I don't think, at least I can't see any I don't have any clear sense that the Romans had a food culture of their own in the way that I've described the Persians and the Greeks and the Galatians as having something that distinguished them. There's no doner kebab for the Romans that identifies them as, you know, that is the food that you know a Roman would have. On the contrary, rather than the Romans bringing a sort of distinctive food to the ancient world, their pattern was that they took rather than they give. And so one thing that the Roman Empire does is, as it stretches out and it encounters new food experiences and products, it brings them to Rome. Fruit from Asia was highly prized, so we're back with our fruit production. The figs of Caunus, peaches from Asia, which were so expensive. They were a delicacy. They cost a denarius a peach in the Rome of Caligula. You paid a whole denarius, which was just for a peach. So you can imagine transport. Plums from Armenia, the sweet cherry, most famously brought from Pontus by Lucullus, none other. So that the cherries were called the Lucullan cherries, the sort of Napoleon Graslar. And Giresun, Kerasus was the most famous cherry-producing town. So importing luxurious fruits was always big business in Rome. But I think what I'd like to suggest is that what is really happening under Roman rule is that the natural resources of the empire are being exploited more systematically by an empire which has the resources for exploitation. It has the roads, it has the transport, it has the administrative systems, so it can suck, as it were, or absorb the products of the provinces into its enormous wealth and power, and that's part of the dynamic of empire. and that then could be translated into various institutions like the annona system, the military supply system, whereby grain, but in the later empire not just grain but other products like wine and oil and animal fats, lard and bacon became extracted and then distributed to Roman armies or to Roman city populations, Constantinople or Rome itself. So there was a sort of a steady and in the long term rather brutal rationalization of food production, transport, consumption in the interests of the imperial sort of control. So food plays a very important part again in Roman power and the way it was worked out. And those demands by the Romans, these pressures, also changed agricultural landscapes. And so that's clear in Turkey when much of southern Asia Minor becomes turned over to olive oil production, not for local consumption for the most part, but to feed or produce or supply Constantinople, or also even the Roman frontier armies. Northwest Anatolia, the old province of Bithynia, becomes almost a sort of garden suburb, literally, of Constantinople, with very high production of sort of garden and produce for the swollen population of the capital. So the demands of Rome slant and orient production patterns. Thrace, European Thrace, sort of west of Istanbul, becomes Constantinople's local breadbasket, used for even more intensive cereal agriculture than before. Of course, they brought a lot from Egypt on the ships, but they also had an intensive local production as well. So in all this, food production has become a much more pragmatic business. We've rather lost sight of the sort of, as it were, the pleasures of food, and with this sort of industrialized, rather brutalized development of systems that bring food to centers of Roman power. And I think I sort of find a modern analogy quite helpful here. By comparing the place of food, as I understand it, in, say, North American and European culture. In Europe and in Turkey, food is still a very important cultural marker. It defines people on a very local basis. Often, we produce the best chickpeas or the best pistachios or whatever it might be, and you all immediately recognize which parts of Turkey you're talking about, because that's and that's very, very distinctive. And that's certainly true across Europe, where you have endlessly varied micro-environments, each with strong historical local cultural traditions, and food plays a very important part within them. Whereas, I would crudely generalize and say, in the United States, which has forged a sort of united common identity for its giant patchwork of immigrant groups, stretching across an entire continent, local food variations are of course apparent, reflecting the different productive capacities of different regions. So I'm not denying that, but for the most part, food does not function as a major identity marker, as it does, I think, for European and Turkish experience. As in the modern United States, and I think this helps with thinking about food in the Roman Empire, that food was an all-important commodity. Its production was of great economic significance, but it doesn't become a major indicator of cultural trends and developments. And so the cosmopolitan, universalizing nature of the Roman Empire doesn't encourage the development of strong local cultural markers, and food accordingly is less significant as a cultural icon than it had been in the classical Hellenistic periods or under the Persian Empire. So that's really the final stage in my attempt to trace a thread through the food history of Turkey, leaving of course far more unsaid than said, because we only have time to just touch on a few items that may have historical significance, and so I hope it's given you something to think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. I do think that there was a lot to think about, and that a lot was mentioned, and I'm sure that there are a lot of questions about many of the things that were mentioned. So if anybody has a question, let me start then. The Persians, you said large land estates. Do we have to imagine then that they were actually totally centralized food production that was then afterwards redistributed? Or is that too extreme?
I don't think it's too extreme, but I think it goes beyond my knowledge, and I think it probably goes beyond our evidence to say how we. I'm not sure that we know in detail how food production was actually organised by a centralist state with dependent lands and so forth. Yes, you put me on notice for a research project that I haven't accomplished yet.
All right. Maybe. Yes.
It's not a question. You told there was not time enough to mention everything, but from the second millennium, from the Hittite text, it's also an important source. We have many terms of food. Many of them we don't know the translation. We don't know what was it, but there are many sorts of bread, for example, in the Hittite text, and so it's just another thing.
Yes, I wish that first of all, I read Hittite, but it's a comfort to know that some of these words are untranslatable anyway. But yeah, no, it would be, surely somebody can tell a story like the one I'm trying to tell for the later periods about, the Hittite period, about not just what food was being produced, but in what context it was being consumed, and how that related to the Hittites as an imperial power or as a controlling power, what part food might have played in the way they grew there and dominated north central Turkey. Do you know, has somebody done a study of Hittite food in that sort of sense?
Yeah, from the festival ritual text, there are some studies about bread, specific studies, but there is Volkerkas, Materia Magica. There are also foods used in the rituals,
yes,
in the celebrations, for example. But there are some smaller studies also.
Also a major study by Harry Hoffman with the title, I think, Nutritoro.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. As you know, the ancient Roman famous cookbook, the Epicus, is there a similar written material for the ancient Anatolian food recipe?
I don't think we have a recipe. The best parallel, it's not a parallel, but Galen, who was from Pergamon, and he has some wonderful biographical passages about himself as a young man growing up, and he obviously went into the countryside and villages, and he talks about what they were eating and producing, and so they're not recipes, but he wrote a whole treatise on the the qualities and properties of foodstuffs, which is encyclopedic. I mean, it goes through the whole list, and then it lists all these foods, and then often itemizes the ways in which they were being cooked or consumed, so, well, it's not a cookbook, but it's actually a very, very interesting social panorama of what food was being consumed in rural area around in northwest Turkey, and it's one of the most fascinating sources for understanding Roman Anatolia there. I put it a sort of section in my Anatolia book about it because it might have been a bit out of proportion, but I mean, I just thought this was such good material that somebody had to draw attention to it. It's had quite a lot of attention in the recent literature as well, but not recipe books that I know
No,
of.
but just some written material.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. You have mentioned the introduction of Oriental species or Armenian plums, etc., as to trigger or act as an agent to for the downfall, moral downfall of the Romans. How about the physical environment, the nature? Do you have in mind any anecdotes regarding that? The deterioration of the nature, invasion of the nature with the Oriental or exotic species?
So I'm not quite sure what you mean that somehow a natural product or environment could have been brought from the east, shall we say, to Rome, and that was a source of
a disturbance for the civic or physical environment,
Yeah.
especially the Rome itself.
Good question. Very hard to answer. I mean, obviously, the introduction of these species was not in itself, in reality, a source of corruption at all. I mean, it brought new species to the western part of the Roman Empire, to Italy, and eventually even to Britain, which proved a fairly harmless enrichment of people's lives and that. The idea that there was this sort of profuse oriental nature, that all these things grew in wonderful profusion, and that itself was a source of corruption to Rome. I suspect. I wonder if I'm just thinking of Virgil's The Georgics, a poem about, ostensibly about agriculture, but actually about morals and about Romanness. And there are certainly themes in the Georgics which might begin to fit your model, but I'm not sure I could pick them out now.
Yes, I will have a look. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Do we have any research about the productivity of agricultural production over time on Anatolia? Or how much
Whether they improved production levels?
over time coming to the Ottoman times, or how the industrialization affected the productions?
Well, of course, we're talking about a pre-industrial period anyway, but going back to Galen again, another of his treatises talks about his father, I think, who was an estate owner, started to do selective breeding of wheat species to improve yields. And Galen talks about this process, so that's something which will be familiar to a modern agriculturalist, and clearly was familiar as a appropriate process for an ancient farmer, especially a scientifically minded one, as his family was. So, in principle, yes, I'm sure that the development of... I think it wasn't... I mean, there were two ways in which this could happen. First of all, you could actually selectively breed, better strains of wheat, or more productive strains. The other is, of course, taking a product that occurs in one region, introducing it for the first time to a new region where conditions for growth are excellent, and then actually producing more by... And that was only possible with you know, the movement, control of large areas, the possibility of introducing crops from one area to another. And I mean, there's been research on that phenomenon. Couldn't give you a bibliography, but I'm sure I could find one. Yes, but your basic question as to whether we actually has anybody done any serious work which shows that production of foodstuffs grew in a particular region, or maybe in a province or something, over time, and how you set up a scientific project that could measure that. I'm not sure that that's been done. I mean, it sounds as if it's something that should be done with, you know, the right resources, the right types of methodology.
I think that there is a follow-up question.
I suspect, not a question, but a little comment. I'm not an archaeologist, my apologies. But you know, Turkish botanist Hikmet Biran provides a lot of material with respect to you know, the terrain of Turkey, Anatolia, and he basically calls it a very old and tired terrain because it had been worked on for centuries, and I'm sure there must be some work on it. And his book, unfortunately not translated into English, Alıç Ağacı ile Sohbetler, is a must.
Right.
Okay, one last question over there.
I wonder how this wheat production that was started in Anatolia and Mesopotamia was spread to the world in what time period, and this know-how and the seeds. Now, how was this spread to the world? To the other continents?
I guess that there are going to be people in this room who can answer that question better than I can. I'm not an early Neolithic specialist. I mean, my understanding of it is that you know, that this earliest domestication, which was investigated in Turkey and Mesopotamia and so on, occurred in particular sort of favoured pockets of southeast Turkey, south central Turkey, the Konya Plain, further east, and that it took some hundreds or even low thousands of years for that domestication process to accomplish itself, to come to a point where you could say that the society had moved from being, you know, basically without domesticated cereal products to becoming largely dependent on cereal agriculture. But there's quite a lot of grey areas at both ends, the use of wild plants before the introduction of domesticated plants and so on and so forth, and then the dissemination of that new technology, if you like, or that which moves slowly up, or slowly faster, I don't know, somebody can tell me much better than I can, in the direction of Southeast Europe and probably eastwards to Iran as well. As I say, I'm slightly out of my depth in the details, but that's of course a hugely studied process. I mean, that's one of the big issues that early prehistoric archaeologists are very anxious to answer in various ways.
Okay, I would like to thank Stephen once more. I think he has given us all quite a lot of food for thought. And I would like now to invite all of you to sample some of the contemporary produce. So, a glass of wine, some product of the times.